The snowstorm raged fiercely that night, an unstoppable force of nature that blanketed the city in a suffocating white silence. The wind howled like a wild beast, swirling the flakes into a blinding fury that obscured everything in sight. Luna, a small gray cat with fur as thick as the winter coat she never had, walked carefully through the snow-covered alleyways. The bitter wind bit through her thick fur, chilling her to the bone. Her body shivered from the cold. But she had long since grown used to the harsh conditions of life on the streets. It was a life of survival, one where every day was a struggle, and the night was her only companion. Her stomach ached with hunger, gnawing at her insides, but there was nothing she could do about it. The city, once full of bustling activity and warmth, was now nothing more than a vast, frozen wasteland. Luna's eyes, wide and alert, scanned her surroundings as she padded through the snow. Her small paws left tiny indentations in the fresh powder, but no one would see them. The streets were eerily empty, save for the occasional stray dog or rat, creatures as desperate as she was. Luna had learned to avoid them, learned to trust no one but herself. Her survival instinct was sharp, honed over months of wandering alone. She had seen too many things that the world didn't want to acknowledge. The cold was relentless, and Luna could feel it creeping into her bones, draining her of energy. She had found shelter in abandoned buildings and alleyways, but even those were starting to feel like traps, each one colder and more barren than the last. She had become a shadow, a forgotten soul in a city that no longer cared. Yet, despite the isolation, Luna's resolve had never faltered. She kept moving, kept searching for that one moment when things might be different, when hunger and loneliness might fade. And then, amidst the howling wind and the endless white that seemed to swallow the world whole, something caught her attention, a faint, soft cry that pierced the cold silence. It was barely audible, but unmistakable. Luna froze, her senses heightened. It wasn't the usual sounds of the street, no barking dogs, no rustling rats. This cry was something else, something fragile and desperate. Her heart skipped a beat, and the hunger that had consumed her for hours faded into the background. A strange pull tugged at her, something primal that made her forget the cold, forget the hunger. It was a cry for help, a cry that seemed to echo through the night, desperate and full of pain. She couldn't ignore it, no matter how cold or how weak she felt. The cry came again, weaker this time, carried on the wind like a whisper of anguish. Luna's fur bristled, and her body tensed. The city around her seemed to fall away as she stood still, listening. There was something in that cry that spoke to her, something that stirred memories she had buried deep within her, memories of kindness, of warmth, of a time before the streets had claimed her. For a moment she hesitated. The cold was unbearable, and her body ached with exhaustion. The streets were dangerous, and yet, in that fleeting moment of stillness, Luna felt a surge of determination that she hadn't known in months. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Without thinking, Luna's paws began to move toward the sound. She walked through the snow, her heart pounding in her chest. Each step was a struggle, the snow biting at her paws and the wind tearing at her fur. But she couldn't stop now. Not when someone, or something, was in need. She had no idea what awaited her, but in that moment Luna knew one thing for certain: she had to help. Her heart skipped a beat, a jolt of fear and concern running through her. She drew closer, her paws light and careful, her fur standing on end as her eyes grew wide with disbelief. The cry, the faint, desperate cry that had led her here, still echoed in her ears, pulling her forward like a magnet. As she got closer, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a bundle of rags, not just a forgotten thing in the snow. It was a child. The small figure, no older than a few months, lay helplessly in the cold, abandoned like something thrown away. Luna's heart tightened as she gazed at the tiny face, so pale against the white snow, her own paws trembling in sympathy. The child's tiny hands were curled into little fists, frozen from the cold, their small body trembling with each breath. A slight shiver shook the fragile frame, a tremor so weak it almost blended with the wind. It was the cry of the wind that she had heard, but now it was clear. It wasn't the wind at all, it was the child struggling to survive in the cold. Luna stood still for a moment, her wide eyes locked onto the tiny form. The world seemed to disappear, and all she could hear was the soft, shallow breathing of the child, fighting against the elements. She could hear the wind howling around them, But in this moment, it felt as if everything else had faded away. All that existed was this child, lying alone in the snow, too young, too vulnerable to survive on its own. The cruel truth of the streets hit Luna like a wave. The world had no mercy. The streets had no compassion. She knew that better than anyone. Life here was about survival, about fighting against the cold, the hunger, the loneliness. No one ever looked back. No one ever cared. And yet, as she stood there, her instincts so deeply rooted in self-preservation screamed at her to turn around, to walk away, to save herself. "It isn't your problem," a voice inside her whispered. "You have nothing to give. You need to survive." But Luna couldn't move. She couldn't leave. Not now. The child's cry had pierced something deep inside her, something that had been buried for so long. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a cry that called to something primal within her, a pull that she couldn't ignore. She thought of the cold, of the hunger that gnawed at her every day. She thought of the streets she had wandered alone for so long, and the loneliness that had consumed her. But now, this child so small, so fragile was here, alone in the very same cold that had claimed so much of her life. Luna's heart ached. Her eyes filled with a deep, painful empathy, and she felt the weight of her own survival fade into the background. It didn't matter anymore. The child mattered. It was a living, breathing soul, just like her. For a long moment, Luna stood frozen in the snow, the biting cold numbing her fur, her claws digging into the snow beneath her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she stared down at the child, unsure of what to do, unsure if she even could help. The fear in her heart, the voice that told her to leave, grew louder, but the pull of the child's need was stronger. Slowly, almost against her will, Luna stepped forward. Her movements were hesitant, unsure, but with each step she took, the weight of what was happening settled deeper into her heart. She was drawn to the child as if some invisible force was guiding her, a force that said this was her moment, the reason she had survived all the years on the streets. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was here for a reason. Luna knelt beside the child, her body shaking from the cold, her eyes soft with concern. She nudged the small, fragile form gently, her nose brushing against the child's cheek, warm against the icy skin. The child's tiny body was so cold it was like touching ice. But Luna didn't pull away. She stayed there, her small body curled around the child, offering the only warmth she had left. She didn't know if she could save the child. She didn't know if it was too late. But she couldn't leave. Not now. As the wind howled and the snow continued to fall around them, Luna wrapped her tiny body around the child, trying to shield it from the cruel cold. Her fur was not enough to protect them both, but she stayed close, her heart pounding, and her thoughts racing. This was more than survival now. This was a choice to care, to protect, and to fight for something beyond herself. And as Luna huddled there, with the child in her arms, she knew that in this moment she wasn't just a stray, a cat fighting against the harsh world. She was something more. She was the lifeline for this tiny soul, this fragile, helpless creature. And she would not let go. The storm raged on, its fury unrelenting. Snow whipped through the air, stinging and cold, and the wind howled, cutting through the night like a blade. Luna's fur, thick as it was, couldn't shield her from the biting chill that seemed to penetrate deep into her bones. She pressed her small body closer to the baby, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to keep it warm. The baby's tiny form trembled against her, its fragile body shaking with every gust of wind. Luna's stomach ached with hunger, but it was nothing compared to the cold that was seeping into her, draining her strength. It had been hours since she found the baby, and the world around them seemed to disappear into a swirling white haze. The only sound she could hear was the wind and the baby's shallow, shaky breathing. She knew the child was cold, but it was so small, so delicate Luna didn't know if it would survive much longer in this storm. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a way to save them both. The streets were empty. There was no sign of anyone who could help. No shelter nearby, no warm place to hide from the storm. Luna's paws, heavy with exhaustion, barely lifted from the snow as she stumbled forward, trying to find anything that could offer shelter. But the cold was relentless, the snow endless. There was nothing. Luna paused for a moment, her breath shallow, her fur stiff from the freezing wind. She couldn't stop. She had to keep moving, keep the baby safe. But her body was so tired, so weak. Every step felt like it took everything she had. The hunger, the cold, the pain, they were all starting to overwhelm her. But the baby needed her. The baby was depending on her. And Luna couldn't let it die alone in the snow. With a deep breath, Luna pushed forward again. Her legs trembled beneath her, and every step felt like a struggle, but she couldn't stop. The baby needed her. The baby deserved to live. Luna had been alone for so long, but now, with this tiny life in her arms, she couldn't turn back. She had to find a way. She kept walking, each step slower than the last. Her body felt like it was made of lead, every movement a battle against the cold and exhaustion. But she couldn't stop. She had to keep going. For the baby. For this tiny soul who was so helpless in the storm. She couldn't think about her own hunger, her own pain. All she could think about was the child, so cold and vulnerable in her arms. The storm howled around them, the wind biting, the snow falling in thick, swirling sheets. Luna felt weaker with each passing minute, but she didn't stop. No matter how tired, no matter how cold, she couldn't let the baby down. The storm could try to tear them apart, but Luna's heart was strong, and it kept pushing her forward, step by step. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was protecting something, someone, and that made her stronger than the cold. Luna didn't know how long they had been walking, or how much longer she could keep going. The storm seemed endless, the cold unyielding. But she would keep fighting. She would keep moving, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how weak she felt. The baby was depending on her, and Luna wasn't about to let it die out here in the snow. With every step, her resolve grew stronger. She wouldn't stop. She couldn't. The baby needed her, and Luna would do whatever it took to keep it alive. She didn't know how long they could survive in this storm, but one thing was clear: she wasn't giving up. The baby was her responsibility now, and she would fight with everything she had to keep them both safe. Just when Luna felt like she couldn't go any further, when the storm felt like it was swallowing them whole, she saw an old building in the distance with a faint light shining through the cracks in the windows. Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't be sure, but it looked like the warmth they so desperately needed. With the last bit of strength she had, she pushed forward, her legs shaking from exhaustion but somehow still carrying her. Every step felt like a small victory, but she wasn't going to stop until she got to that light. The wind was relentless, biting at her fur, but Luna kept her eyes locked on that soft glow. She didn't care what was inside. She just needed to get there. The baby, still shivering in her arms, made weak cries, and Luna pushed herself harder. She couldn't let the baby suffer out here in the cold any longer. When Luna finally reached the door of the building, it was slightly open. A rush of warm air greeted her as she nudged it with her paw and stumbled inside. The sudden warmth wrapped around her like a hug, but before she could fully process what was happening, a man appeared at the door. He was dressed in a heavy coat, his face hidden behind a scarf, and his eyes went wide when he saw Luna and the baby. Without missing a beat, he stepped forward, gently taking the baby from her arms. "Come inside," he said, his voice soft but urgent. Quickly. Luna, too exhausted to think, let him guide her inside. She collapsed onto a small cot by the fire, her body trembling from the cold she'd been fighting for so long. The man quickly wrapped the baby in a warm blanket and set to work, checking for frostbite, warming the child gently. Luna watched, her eyes heavy, as the man did everything he could to help. Slowly, the baby's cries softened, replaced by a calm, steady breathing. Luna felt her heart swell with relief. The baby was going to be okay. Once the baby was taken care of, the man turned to Luna. He handed her a bowl of warm food, the smell making her stomach growl. She didn't have the energy to lift her head at first, but the warmth of the food was enough to get her to take a bite. The taste, simple but comforting, was exactly what she needed. As she ate, Luna felt herself start to relax. Her eyelids were heavy, her body aching with exhaustion. But she didn't have to worry anymore. The baby was safe, wrapped up warm and sound asleep in a crib near the fire. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Luna finished the food slowly, savoring every bite. When she was done, she lay back on the cot, letting the warmth from the fire sink into her bones. The storm was still raging outside, but inside everything was calm. The baby was safe, and for the first time in so long, Luna allowed herself to rest. She closed her eyes, her body sore but grateful. This wasn't the end, but it was the first step toward healing for both her and the baby. They were safe now, and for the first time in a long while, Luna let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The next morning, the building that had offered them refuge was filled with people. Doctors and caretakers bustled around the room, their hands moving quickly as they examined the baby. Luna, still curled up by the fire, kept a watchful eye on the scene, her ears flicking at every sound. Though her body was drained, her heart was full of relief. The baby was in good hands now, and the warmth of the room felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. The doctors worked quickly, checking the baby for signs of any lasting damage from the cold. It was clear that the child was a miracle, surviving in the harsh storm for so long. As they worked, the baby's cries became less frantic, its tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Luna couldn't help but watch, feeling a deep sense of pride. She had kept the baby alive, and now it seemed like there was hope. When the caretakers finally turned to her, their expressions soft and grateful, they acknowledged what Luna had done. "This little one owes its life to you," one of the doctors said gently, bending down to scratch behind Luna's ears. The cat leaned into the touch, a purr rumbling in her chest. It felt good to be recognized, to be seen as more than just a stray. For a moment, Luna felt like she had a place in this world. As the morning wore on, phone calls were made, and soon, the baby's parents, or at least the caretakers, arrived. They were a young couple, clearly overwhelmed with emotion as they saw the child, now wrapped in a warm blanket, safe and sound. The father gently scooped the baby into his arms, his eyes brimming with tears. "We've been looking everywhere for our child," the mother whispered, holding her hand to her chest. "I can't believe this little one is still alive." Luna watched from her corner, her eyes soft with emotion. It was hard not to feel a sense of pride. She had done something good, something important. The caretakers expressed their gratitude, telling everyone about how the baby had been missing for hours in the storm, and how they had been frantic, not knowing if they would ever see their child again. The room quieted as the family huddled around the baby, relieved and grateful. But even in the midst of this joy, Luna felt a pang in her heart. She had fulfilled her purpose, but now she was still just a stray, alone in the world. Her role as protector had come to an end, and though she was proud of what she had done, she couldn't help but wonder what now. The caretakers, the doctors, and the family all spoke kindly to her, offering a few gentle strokes behind her ears. But Luna knew that the reality was harsh. They weren't her family. They weren't going to take her in. She had done what she could, but now it felt like the world was moving on without her. The baby was going to recover. The parents were reunited with their child. But Luna was still the stray who had wandered into their lives, a nameless cat with no real place to call home. She had done something extraordinary, and she had touched the hearts of everyone in that room. But now she was left with a question she didn't know how to answer: what would happen to her. She watched as the family gathered their things, preparing to leave. The doctors and caretakers talked among themselves, giving updates on the baby's condition, discussing the next steps for the child's care. But no one mentioned what would happen to Luna. No one spoke of a future for her, even after everything she had done. As the last of the visitors trickled out, Luna stood up slowly, stretching her stiff limbs. She glanced at the family one last time before turning away. Her future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: her journey wasn't over. She had found her purpose, and maybe, just maybe, she would find a place to belong again. As the hours passed, Luna wandered quietly through the building, her thoughts heavy. She had done what she set out to do. The baby was safe, and the parents were reunited with their child. But what about her? The warmth of the shelter, the kindness from the doctors, and the soft words of the family seemed like fleeting moments now. She was still a stray. Alone. But just as Luna was about to slip into the shadows, quietly fading from their lives, the door opened again. The couple, the baby's parents, stood there, their faces filled with emotion. The mother was holding the baby close to her chest, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something or someone. "Luna," the mother said softly, her voice trembling with gratitude. We can never thank you enough. You saved our child's life." Luna's ears perked up at the sound of her name. The parents were looking at her, not with pity, but with a deep respect. The father stepped forward, his eyes soft. "You stayed with her in the storm. You kept her alive when no one else could. We don't know how we can ever repay you." The mother knelt down to Luna's level, her hands gently reaching out to stroke Luna's fur. Luna leaned into the touch, her body still trembling slightly from the exhaustion of the night before. She wasn't sure what to make of all this. What did it mean? Were they just thanking her for her bravery and then sending her back to the streets? Would she always be a stray, no matter how much she had done? But then the mother's next words hit her like a wave of warmth. "We've been thinking," she said, her eyes filled with something more than just gratitude. "We can't imagine our lives without you. You're part of our family now." Luna's heart skipped a beat. Was it possible? Could they really want her? The father smiled, his expression warm and genuine. "You've already shown what kind of heart you have, Luna. You've protected our daughter, and we can't just let you go back to the cold." The mother scooped the baby up a little higher in her arms, and Luna felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. The baby, once so fragile and alone, was now safe, and so was she. The family, though strangers just hours ago, had become something much more. "We'd like to adopt you," the father said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've earned a place in our home, in our family." Luna could hardly believe what she was hearing. The weight of the world seemed to lift from her shoulders. She had never had a family, never had a place to belong, but now she was being offered one. The bond she had formed with the baby, the connection she felt with the parents, it was all real, and they wanted to keep her. Tears welled up in Luna's eyes as she rubbed her face against the father's hand. Her journey, one that had been filled with cold nights and loneliness, had come full circle. She had saved a life, and in return, she had found the love and warmth she had always longed for. The family took Luna home that very day. She was welcomed with open arms, and the house, once empty, now felt like a home. The baby, now thriving and healthy, grew up knowing the story of how Luna had saved her life. As she got older, the child would pet Luna's fur and listen to the story, her eyes wide with admiration. "Luna is my hero," she would say, a smile on her face as she hugged the cat tightly. Luna, for the first time in her life, had everything she needed: love, safety, and a place to call home. She wasn't just a stray anymore. She was a cherished member of the family, adored and appreciated for the hero she was. The bond between her and the baby, once formed in the storm, now grew deeper every day. Luna's journey had taught her that even the smallest acts of kindness, even the most unlikely heroes, can transform lives. She had found her purpose, and in the process, she had found the love and family she had always dreamed of.